All right, now I'm ready to start. I'm very excited and honored to present to you and to introduce our special guest. And here he is. I'm not sure where he is on your screen compared to mine, but he is right below my screen. I am very thrilled to introduce to you Thomas Horejes. He is the assistant provost at Gallaudet University. I am very grateful that he volunteered his time out of his very busy schedule right now to support our small program. So before we begin, again, I just want to remind anybody that to have the best viewing experience, make sure that you hide all non-video participants. You can do that by clicking on Gallery View. All right, well, hello, Thomas. I'm really happy that you're here tonight.
Oh, good to see you.
So I guess the first question I'd like to start off with is to dive into your childhood and your background. I'm curious, who are you and what are some things you would like to share with us tonight about yourself?
Oh, well, I have no script for this tonight. So first of all, I want to thank you, Briella, and Tennessee School for the Deaf for supporting this very important workshop. I think it's so critical, whether you think it's a small campus or so forth. I think the parents and having professional support with early intervention work that you're doing, parents, you are making the right decision, rolling up your sleeves by being involved in this little workshop tonight, showing how to advocate for your child. I recognize this. And also the journey as a parent is not easy for anyone, for any parent. I, as a father of 3 children, I have seen challenges myself. And so I can imagine if I had a deaf child that would add to the level of challenges, but it doesn't have to be that way with an appropriate support system in the way and resources that can support you, prevent these barriers and find resources. I'm often talking about the barriers. And so I'm happy to have the opportunity to support the parents and answer any questions that you have. So about me, well.
So maybe just tell us something that you like to do in your spare time.
Reading, lots and lots of reading. When it's not cold outside, I like to ride my bicycle. I live in DC, so I don't have a car. I ride my bicycle often to and from different places. I'm very interactive. I'm an extrovert. I have a lot of energy. I love meeting new people and learning new information. And I'm always wanting to learn more knowledge.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm wondering, where are you from? Are you from the DC area?
I'm actually from St. Louis, Missouri, from a strong oral community. And so now they have 3 different oral places there. One where I grew up and went there for 10 years. The second one is MOG.
OOG.
Okay. And the third one is in St. Joseph's. These 3 oral schools there are in St. Louis. And so I graduated there from Central Institute for the Deaf there. And then I was mainstreamed after that into public schools. And then I went to get my bachelor's, master's, PhD at the Justice Studies. Okay. So let me go back.
So let's go back to your schooling and the experience you had growing up. You went to, is that CSD? Is that the correct initials in St. Louis? So I'm wondering, talking about going to a deaf school in Missouri might be a little further from St. Louis. So I'm wondering why your parents decided to send you to CID over other schools in the state.
Oh, that's a good question. So CID had a strong parent-infant program that the other schools did not have. And so that was the key for my parents My mother was 18 when I was born. I think my father was 21 or 22, and so he was young high. And so they really didn't know what to do. And so um, you remember back then, but in the yellow pages, maybe some of you are not as old as me, remember that. We used to have yellow pages in the back of the phone book, and you could flip through that and find different agencies. And so when I was 6 months old, my parents were flipping through the yellow pages under hearing loss or maybe hearing impairment in that section. And so there was a central institute for the deaf, a residential school for the deaf. And so they put me there, and the rest is history.
So I'm curious. Your parents did some research. They looked through the yellow pages, but what was their first reaction when they realized that you were deaf? You said that you were 6 months old. You were 6 months old when they identified you as being deaf. I'm just curious their reaction.
They were grieved. It's the first deaf child that they'd ever met, or deaf person was me. And so that's often the case with parents. And when they found out that I was deaf, really, it wasn't positive at first. Initially, it's where the doctors would say, "Oh, I'm sorry that your child has failed his hearing, his audiogram," and so they were grieved. Oh, my child, I failed my child already. Um, just the hearing loss. They had no other information other than, here's your child, he has hearing loss. And so my parents were devastated. They didn't have a support system back then, but today we do have availability throughout the United States, and that can provide support for deaf children.
And of course, I'm sure that your parents were processing and going through their grief at the same time, and then having to send you to CID. You mentioned that CID was an oral program. Does that mean that you grew up with speech and listening focus? Did you learn to sign? When did you learn to sign?
No, I didn't sign initially until I went to college. So, well, let me back up. I did learn ASL when I was in college. When I graduated from CID at age 10, I was fully oral. I could read lips. Then when I went into the mainstream setting, I was the only deaf child and requested an FM system to try to hear the teachers using the microphone. And by the way, I have a profound hearing loss, that my decibels are like 110, so I am deaf. I used to wear hearing aids, trying to listen to different things, but it was not successful. I would just try to catch things as best I could. The biggest challenge I had between CID and the mainstream program was that CID had a smaller classroom size. There were 2 or 3 other deaf students in the classroom with one teacher all day long. And so I got used to that environment. And then when they placed me in the 5th grade in a classroom with 25 to 30 other students who were hearing and the teacher, then, I had a homeroom teacher, but for specific courses and classes like math, history, and so forth, I would rotate throughout the day. And so it was a huge adjustment trying to read lips and hear. And the students, various types of students, I was in front of the class trying to read the teacher's lips. And then for questions, if someone raised their hand up behind me, the teacher would, point to them, and I'd have to turn around and try to find out who was speaking and see if I could find catch the question for the person it was. But by the time I did, I'd missed the first part of the question. And then I'd have to see only the second one. Then I'd look back to the teacher and she would explain for several minutes the answer. But again, throughout that process, I didn't know but only half the question. So my mind and my eyes really had to work overtime. And so it was not successful for me. I did not do well. I was failing. We had an IEP meeting to discuss where we could have an interpreter, but with the understanding it was an oral interpreter, not someone who signed. She would just speak to me. And so I don't know about you people, but sitting looking at a mouth all day long speaking was not successful for me. So finally, we had simultaneous communication where you talk and sign at the same time. And I was able to pick up things much quicker. And so it was just, totally immersed with sign language at that point. And so it wasn't total ASL, it was SimCom until I went into college. I had an interpreter who gave me pure ASL only and not spoken. And so since that time, I've had only ASL.
Wow, that's interesting. And I think it's important to mention that some of our audience may not be familiar with the difference between simultaneous communication, signed exact English, and ASL. So I might take a moment to explain those. SimCom, simultaneous communication, means that you are speaking and signing at the same time. And it seems that it seems like that would be ideal, but it does really hurt because you're really having to choose one language over the other. You can't really speak two languages at this simultaneously. Like, could you speak French and Spanish at the same time? No, so that applies with ASL and spoken English. Now, SEE means signed exact English. Signing exact English. And that means that you are signing English order. And you are using the initials. You're using initialized signs, like you might do R for red instead of red with just the one finger. You're using R for red. In ASL, that what Tommy and I are using right now, it's a true language. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but you did not learn ASL until you were in college when you finally met an ASL interpreter. So let's go back to signing again. You transferred to a mainstream public school, and most people would say mainstreaming with 2 5-hand shapes, but you did one with 5 shapes. So explain the difference. What's the subtle difference between the meaning of those two signs?
Well, that means that I was the only deaf child in the public school environment. So statistically, most of the time you'd say 58% of our deaf children today in deaf ed are mainstreamed, but out of that 85%, 90% of that group are the only child within that system. And so I advocate for mainstreaming and supporting deaf and hard of hearing programs. But the key, again, is to have another deaf student, to have a deaf peer. I cannot emphasize how important having another deaf peer is. When I was mainstreamed in the public school system in 5th grade, I still got together with my deaf friends who also graduated from CID. On the weekends, my parents and their parents, they were friends, and they would drive to each other's homes so that we could socialize. I would still be able to socialize with my deaf peers, and so that was so important. If it had not been for that, I would not have been able to develop my emotional, social, and cognitive abilities. And also curricular activities were key for me, in sports, being very involved with my hearing friends, and so having a relationship with them. And so I would see those friends, and I had a sense of identity. So it's critical that when a deaf person comes in, like with the 5th grade, I was the only deaf person. It's very intimidating and scary. And so having other deaf friends and having sports, I had a balance, a healthy balance that made me be successful.
I like what you just said. And so let me emphasize that again, that one of the keys to your success was having peers who were like you, the peers that you could relate to. And that's important whether you're deaf or hearing. I think hearing have more common bonds. I think it's very important for our parents right now that are watching to keep that in the back of your mind. It's important to provide that social opportunity as well for your child. And it doesn't matter what it is, be it sports or artistic or some kind of school activity, just hanging out with your deaf buddies. I think all of that is really important. I'm going to turn off my virtual background. It seems to be interfering a little bit. All right, so it's boring but clear. All right, so I did want to go back to one of the points that you just made, that your mom would often take you to meet your friends, the friends that you grew up with at CID. And you mentioned to me previous to this program that your mom was she was completely in support. She had a great support system. Can you talk about that?
Yes, my mother was my strongest advocate. She was my speech therapist. She was my teacher in many, many different ways. So for me, growing up, learning to speak and so forth, I didn't always focus on that at school, but learning speech therapy, I had to do that 24/7. It's a 24/7 process. And so if not at school, then at home for breakfast, after dinner, we had stories. And so that was a continuous help. And my mother was that person for me. And she would drive me to get together with my CID friends. And then later, I recognized that she was also socializing with the mothers of the CID students. So she'd drop off the kids, but then the friends had that social time, the parents as well. So they started to identify as like a social club where they had established a bowling league. Every Friday night they would get together for wine. And now I don't know, I guess the parents are all over the place and different. There's nothing wrong with Zooming and doing virtual happy hour on Friday, getting together, because for my mother, it was the only opportunity they had to exchange information to say what would work for each of their children and talk with other parents, and the emotional equivalency of learning that support and exchanging that information. So I would encourage you parents to get together and get connected. You are not alone in this process, and you don't have to feel that way. So you can collaborate with other parents and feed off of each other's information. And it's, less research. You could do double that information gathering together.
Yes, and I think that's something that a lot of families and professionals don't realize. It's not it's not enough to just provide support to the child. You also need to see how important it is for the families to receive that support. I think that's why our program here, I love working with our families here, because I'm not just focusing on the child, but we're focusing on the whole family. And I think that's important for everyone to keep in mind, that everyone is not the same age as your child. Um, but there are things to make those connections with parents, because who knows, I might make long friends. You mentioned that your mom is still getting together with that group now.
Yes, still. They are still getting together. I'd say about 10 of us are good friends. My CID friends, we're still best of friends. And their mothers still get together the first Friday of every month. Well, prior to COVID anyway. And then during the summer months, they would get together at a house over the weekend at the lake or something. So yes, they still get together even now.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. So now I'd like to ask about your mom's response to you learning American Sign Language. I know that your mom was aware of ASL growing up, but she chose a different route for you. So I'm wondering, once you decided to start learning ASL and you went to Gallaudet University, how did your mom feel about that?
She didn't like it at first. Part of her journey, though, was when she realized, she was told by the oralist and there at the oralist school, oh, they shouldn't sign. That'll slow down his ability to speak. That'll hinder that. But then we found out later that's not true. A child who's born and learns to speak can also learn ASL. There is no evidence to show that it will delay language at any rate. So we've had a lot of research on that now, different articles that show that children who have the ability to learn two languages at the same time, their brain is not delayed with one language over the other. So this is an opportunity. But back in that day, the research data informed us, that kids could learn bilingually. So my mother, as I became more involved in ASL, for me, it was more naturally. I was able to understand expressions and gestures and so forth. But with the hearing equivalents, like with my friends, I'd have to double check their mood or their tone, or but with signs, you could see that clearly, the intention and the tone of what they were saying. And so communication itself, it enhanced it so much more. My mother did ask me when I was in college and I was learning there at the Deaf University. She said, "You're learning sign language? That's good for you?" I said, "Well, no, I'm learning because it says that I'm supposed to learn it for you. No, the question should be that I should learn it to improve my ability to communicate with you." And I said, "Really, Mom?" We never met a parent who was sorry that they learned sign language in the past. To this day, I still have never met a parent who was sorry that they learned sign language. Not at Gallaudet University. I've traveled several places. I've been involved in several meetings with parents and children and so forth. I've never had one say, "I'm sorry that I learned sign language." So my mom realized at that point, I didn't want her to feel burdened, that she was having to learn for me. Of course, she should have, she could have, but I didn't have the right words to express it back then at the time she was learning how important sign language was to me. Now, I used a hearing aid over the years too. And then once I went into Gallaudet, into that environment, the hearing aid wasn't required. But if I ever go back to a place of employment that would require hearing, then I would put my hearing aid back on to accommodate my work environment. And I would probably speak more often. But currently in the job and the environment I'm at Gallaudet, I don't need to speak or use my hearing aid. At home, I do speak. I have 3 children. All 3 are hearing, and I speak to my kids and communicate with them. And so, I'm code switching all the time, speaking English. There's been no delay or regression in that. So when I work throughout the day, I sign at my job.
That's beautiful. I think that shows that an individual journey for every parent. There's not one size fits all. Every journey is unique and is their own based on their own child and their family. And I think that applies to our audience as well. Your communication style and your preferences are all going to vary. It's just important to keep in mind that you should listen to your child and support them in whatever ways possible. Wherever your child's journey takes them, support them all the way. So I know your mother loves you, and that's wonderful. So now I'd like to go back to literacy. You had mentioned that English is good. You have not lost any of your English skills from learning sign language. So as I'm sure you know, there are many deaf people out there who they don't read higher than the 4th grade level. And I'm wondering about your mom or your family and just making sure that you got past the 4th grade level and encouraged you in your reading. And how did they do that?
Well, my mom did a lot of storytelling. She was creative and reading books and so forth. She used a lot of expressions. So I was totally immersed in reading books. My mom did do a good job of pointing things out and reading to me, making it fun for me. And so reading became my pleasure. I was totally immersed in that way. And when I was in public school, I didn't have communication. I would go back and read at the library or get a book or something because communication, maybe I didn't have the opportunity to talk to hearing people. So I would go and read, and that helped me during my journey, and especially when I got my PhD. Deaf students who statistically do not read past the 4th grade, but some deaf students who are in the 4th grade might be skilled in ASL, and so they are fluent in one language that's beyond 4th grade. But because that test design, it's designed for hearing students, we have one language, which is English. But a deaf child who is learning spoken English as their second language if their first language was ASL, you know, there's not much there. They've not been looking at that to measure a child's skill and capabilities. But especially today in higher ed, not at Gallaudet, but other places, they just throw out the ACT scores because the AT scores are very discriminatory in many ways. It doesn't actually provide an accurate measure of a child's awareness, especially from a cultural background. And so middle class, white, privileged, socioeconomic classes, you know, there are other important kinds of information, personality and their culture that should be, personal culture that should be brought into that when we look at that. And so we're holding those statistics to show that deaf people are not ignorant. If they have the proper measurement that's designed to measure their skills, then you'll see it's higher than that.
Yes. So thank you for pointing that out. That is something that often, for deaf people, even as myself, we still have that system of thinking that's ingrained. And so I'm grateful for you to take a moment to point that out. There are different perspectives for everything. All right. I think now is a good time to transition to our Q&A time. So again, for those of you who are new to our programs, I just want to let you know our priority is families. So we'd like for the families to have a chance to ask their questions first. And when it seems that families have finished asking questions, we'll open it up to the professionals in the room. If you would like to ask questions, you can either type it in the chat box and I will sign the questions to the audience. You can start your video and sign the question if you feel prepared to do that. But you can also start your video and speak your question. The interpreter will sign for you.
Also, I want to add, I'm very open, so there's no wrong question. If it's a personal question or if you feel it might be a sensitive or whatever, please, I encourage you. I want to open truths and have an honest discussion with each of you because it's about your child. I'm here to support you. So I would love to be the one that you feel good about asking a question from so when you leave this workshop, then Briella, I've given her permission to share my email, and I'd be glad to sit down with you, have a Zoom meeting, coordinate a time to where I could support you more with this webinar, etc.
Thank you. I love to have an opportunity to have you on our contact list. Doesn't happen very often, but I'm grateful that you are willing to be open and honest and to share with our parents and families. So thank you for that. All right, so let me see if there's any messages in the chat box. All right, I don't see any comments in the chat box, but I see Amy, so go ahead. So hi, it is so nice to meet you. I'm wondering, you moved from a mainstream program. Why did you move to the mainstream program? Okay, we'll hold off on the chat so you can answer this one first.
Okay, so for clarification, you're saying why did I stop at an oral school program and go to mainstream?
Yes, I was just wondering why you made that change, why you went to the mainstream program.
That's a wonderful question. So when I was in the 3rd grade, I was 8 years old at CID, and I had already met their expectations. And so I was ready for mainstream. And I was like, no, I do not want this. I remember at the time very clearly my mother saying, you know, you're going to be ready next year to go to middle school. And I was like, no, I don't want to. I was not emotionally ready. Even though academically I was ready to be mainstreamed, I wanted to stay at CID where I felt safe with my deaf peers. And so finally, 2 years later, it took me 2 years. And when I got in the 5th grade, they kicked me out pretty much so. But a lot of oral programs now are not up to 5th grade. Most of the time, they will keep them up to like oral schools typically do not half students more than age 5 or above. Okay. Some oral schools go above that, but if they have a deaf school for the deaf, they might not. But mainstream programs are mostly afraid of that. And that was, well, for me, it was the most frightening experience of my life. I had my CID friends who I could see on the weekends getting together, though, and that's what helped me to become familiar with the neighborhood and with sports. And it's so important. I didn't realize what an important support system that was to me until much later when I got into 5th grade. Really, for anyone who are scared already and trying to develop their identity and their cliques and looking at each other and all these different groups. And I was the only one deaf. I already had a stigma, and so trying to connect with my friends was a way to confirm my identity and build my confidence. So wonderful question, Amy. Did I see a little baby? Is that your new baby, Amy? Did I see a baby in there?
I think it was. Amy, do you want to show off your babies? This is my daughter. She's deaf, 3 years old.
Oh, I see.
And my son can hear, and he's 4.
Oh, Amy, I want to recognize and applaud you for learning sign language. Your daughter will thank you for learning sign language as well. So even though she's 3, she's not maybe able to say it, she's not able to realize it, but I'm letting you know that you learning sign language it goes a long way toward building a relationship with your daughter. So keep going, keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I always tell the parents, that's the first thing when they're born, when they come in with their baby, the first thing I say is, congratulations, you have a beautiful, healthy baby. And they always seem to be shocked by that, but it's true. That first and foremost, that's the very most important thing, whether they're deaf, whatever their ethnicity is, it doesn't matter, whatever their gender, your baby is not tied to political ideology or anything. This child has been born, and when you bring it from the hospital, you're building what the child's world is and what they'll see. When I was a child growing up, my sense of normalcy was speaking and hearing. I thought that was status quo. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that I never really did speak or hear fluently 100%. And so it's like, So I was always less than normal in that sense, or less than average. But my family and friends realized, there are different categories to being human. And so, I had a positive influence for my identity and emphasized that from my parents. So remember that your child is human first. There are different identity categories, deaf, and they'll have other identities come up as they grow up.
That's beautiful. I think that we are all human, and we are all in the same boat of life, and we're just trying to get through the storm. That's right. We're just navigating through it. All right, there's a question in the chat box that I am going to sign. This is from Tracy Duncan, who is, Karen was first, or Carrie was first. Oh, you're right. Thank you. I overlooked that one. So Carrie is one of our parents in the program, and she's asking you for clarification. Do you think that it's important for deaf children to have English language knowledge and reading at the appropriate level, to read at the appropriate level?
Yes. The problem for deaf children is that they've not had a good support system in place. The teachers themselves are not specialists in deaf ed, or they don't have the curriculum to support that. And so they're learning English and sign language to support the English is missing. So compared to with hearing children, deaf children don't have the auditory ability to hear and match what it is they're writing as the teacher speaks words and they're writing them. They don't make that connection naturally for a deaf child. So with sign language, if you sign the word and you can visualize that, then you can write it. So it gets a little complicated, but in general, yes, we do recognize, that we live in a cultural system where English is a strong suit. But when you're able to speak English, more importantly than ASL, then that's always something I think that parents need to know, that both of those can be beneficial to your child's language skills. It doesn't have to be either or. So that kind of philosophy needs to be thrown out. There are many different ways to support a child's language development, which includes writing English, spoken English, and ASL, and also cute speech. So there are many program availabilities for that.
And also to add that often people envision English and they think that it's just spoken English, but that's not always true. It means being able to read and write English. So as a deaf child, they may not have the ability to speak or hear, but they could still learn to write beautiful English. So I think English doesn't mean you have to speak English. So I would like to have that, make sure that's clear. All right, so the next comment. Oh, and Carrie says thank you. The second question is from Tracy Duncan, who is one of our parent counselors, and she's the coordinator for our Birth to Five program.
Yes.
So I saw you at the EHDI presentation with B. Moog, and was touched by your story of coming together with students and families. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and B. Moog together, and how there was full language access for your students and the process, which is a very important part of the story, and your cooperative and how empowering it was and how that changed the environment for a lot of students.
Tracy, I want to thank you for that positive comment. I remember you as well. And so I'm glad that you remembered. So it's good to see you. Hi. So the goal for me in presenting with Betty Moog, M-O-O-G, was to show the collaborative efforts between spoken English and also working with other
stakeholders
in learning ASL, and having that collaboration, providing a 360 view of resources and support for our deaf child, to provide parents a lot of information to become stronger advocates. Really, the goal is not to allow parents, was to have them have knowledge in many different areas of resources and so forth, to make a holistic decision about their child every day. They are the experts. They are, at the end of the day, they're the ones who know. And they're at the end of the line each day. That's the parents. They know their child best. And yes, they are the experts in both oral, audiologists, speech therapists, all these different professionals, but also those who are doing with language assessment and so forth. Those are the experts. And so providing that information, equal information, to the parents so that they can make the final decision about what's best in terms of their language development. So we had that collaboration with Moog. Moog would go to school all day long, and it was oral, but then after school, her parents would pick her up, but instead they would get together in one room, and I was in that room signing to them while the children had a deaf mentor, like 14 or 15 years old. The mentor was deaf and had graduated maybe from that oral program. And so they would come in and talk to them and model language. So the younger children would look up to that. And so that was very important to have that, for 3, 4, and 5 years old, to look up to someone else who's 14 or 15 who is deaf just like them. That's a very positive affirmation, and it's important for deaf children to see other deaf children that are older and adults, so they don't assume that they're the only one. It's important to have that exposure. So for me, I'm an open book. I know parents would ask me questions, I'd come in, and so that was really nice, a really nice ecosystem. So thank you, Tracy, for allowing me to share that experience with this group.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. That was a wonderful question. I do have some questions in the chat box, but I'm also seeing somebody. Did you want to make a comment? I know Robbie's not your name. I can't remember what you said.
Hi, I'm Danny. I had a question about like the community that with your family, like if you had felt like you had a community with your family, or if it was more of just a community with the deaf community. Because I'm trying to make both those things happen and it's really hard.
Oh, yes. So it's an organic process. Both communities are important. Your deaf child will always be part of both communities, deaf and hearing, always. So a deaf child can try to disband from this or that, but I've seen it happen many times. They realize that's their identity later on. And so it's best to expose them to both communities from the beginning, because both communities are experts at providing the support and the information that they need. It's equally important with deaf and hearing and for the deaf child to see that system where 99.9% of people are hearing, and deaf people with hearing people can coexist.
I hope that answers your question, Danny. Yes, it did. Thank you. Great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go back to the chat box now. Another mom, Marissa, has asked, we are adopting a deaf baby and are currently learning ASL and are considering sending him to TSD, but I don't want him to feel different. So how can I help him to develop good communication and also feel like he belongs to the family? Sounds very similar to Danny's question, but maybe you can expand.
Marissa, great question. So two things. There's two fancy words that I'm going to use: cultural transmission. And that's if you place them at a residential school for the deaf like TSD, and then cultural assimilation. And that's where if you decide to use a mainstreaming program. So your choice will be either placing them at the school for the deaf, where that child will be totally immersed in the deaf community and the deaf culture and learn the language, the cooking, the library. They'll learn everybody there at the Tennessee School for the Deaf. And so the access to that deaf environment, they will have a sense of normalcy. Oh, signing for me, that's normal. And so they have a sense of what it means to be normal and to use sign language with the balance of home where the parents are and the neighborhood where everyone speaks. And so they'll notice this, and they'll notice there's a different, like one house, they use sign language, another house they speak. And so the child will see these two different worlds, and will be able to transition between the two. As far as a mainstream, they might be completely assimilated into that, where that child's sense of normalcy will be spoken language and listening. And so eventually later on, they'll learn, I was never able to speak or hear, and never able to hear. So at 4 or 5, they don't understand that, but they start seeing that's happening. And all these different people, the janitor, the cook, all these people are speaking, and then they think, oh, I'm special, I'm different because I can't do all of that. Whereas at a residential school, they see that everybody's like them. So there's no right or wrong, there's pros and cons, whatever, but the identity of a deaf child, regardless of the placement, if they're at the residential program or mainstream, I've seen some programs that allow the deaf child to do a half a day at the residential school for the deaf and the other half of the day at a public school. I've seen these programs, but I don't know what the structure is, but I know there are some models available today for that. So, and I said Texas, I meant Tennessee earlier, Tennessee School for the Deaf. When Marissa said TSD, I said Texas School for the Deaf, but really I should have said Tennessee. So your deaf child will feel different in the mainstream program. I think they'll feel less different in an environment where everyone is deaf and signs themselves. Good communication, it depends on your perspective. Good communication in a mainstream setting, say he has speech therapy, then I would say communication will be a challenge for them. And for those who are not deaf to be able to sign. You're learning sign language. It depends on how much you enjoy that and how much you're immersed in that. But incidental learning is key because in the mainstream setting, incidental learning is very low for a deaf child. It's only the things that they see, they're not hearing the communication. Whereas at a residential school for the deaf, TSD, the environment is there's more access to incidental learning there. So there's pros and cons in both situations.
Also, let me add that your child may feel different. I am deaf compared to my family who's all hearing in that hearing environment. But if that child already has a strong sense of identity and is confident in who they are, that would not be as painful an experience. It would just be part of who they are and how they're progressing. So it goes back to having a strong identity and knowledge of who they are themselves. Having just is really impactful, I think, as a family member, giving them that sense of identity and supporting and helping them build that confidence and encouraging them. It can help them feel like they can tackle the world.
Also, I want to remind everyone that it's easier as a parent or a hearing person who wasn't born into the hearing world to automatically view mainstream as having the best quality of education rather than a residential school for the deaf. And that's not the case. But because of our involvement, our values and spoken and hearing language, we're more likely subconsciously to prefer a mainstream program because it makes the most sense to us and it's what we're most familiar with and what we have a connection to. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the same with sign language. You parents seeing a deaf person sign, but if I decided not to sign and started speaking to you and I had an interpreter signing, then you would say, oh, wow, then maybe you would view me as more knowledgeable or, I have a PhD, I'm smarter, blah, 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 but I'm still the same person. So just because I choose to sign, it's a different perspective. And so I think a residential school for the deaf gets, a negative viewpoint, and it's not always the case. Mainstream programs, either way, within the states, they have to follow all the regs, both of them, have to have evaluations, performance assessments, et cetera, et cetera. And so they still have high expectations at a residential school, just like they do anywhere else in the state.
That's a great point, definitely. I see one last question. So I know that time is running out. So if you have any final questions, now's your chance. But I will ask Abby's question. She also enjoyed your presentation with Betty last year, and at the ASHA conference.
Mm-hmm.
And wants to know resources for parents that would like to learn both spoken English and American Sign Language. As an SLP, I'm often asked that question. And so how would you respond to them?
I think to learn both ASL and English is awesome for those who are doing that, to learn ASL and English and bilingual approach. Unfortunately, bilingual approach here in the United States is viewed upon as negative. We have a strong
monolingual culture
here in the United States with mainstreaming, with least restrictive environment and separate but not equal. We believe that's been from the Board of Education. They've decided that for several years, but often we benefit the most when we have access to the sign language. When we're looking, it doesn't really conform with the U.S. culture, but we have some countries in the world who rely on a monolingual approach. And other countries, Europe, Africa, they have 2 and 3 different languages. And so the fact that we're doing bilingual here in a world environment here that's like that is wonderful. Whereas just having one language or monolingual approach is not. So people are trained to learn, at least 1 or 2 languages in other countries. So for a deaf child to have access to be able to perform an ASL and English increases their job opportunities. If I didn't know sign language, then I would be only in a hearing field. And Gallaudet, I wouldn't be the associate provost for Gallaudet University. But because I can use sign language, then I can do that. And I've learned more than 1 language. And so that's increased job opportunities for me, and it would for them, and it would look good on a resume.
For sure. Oh, and Abby just sent me a message. It was a private message that said, I meant spoken English and ASL like SimCom, if they wanted to be able to SimCom.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, not SimCom. I'm not completely clear. Okay.
I think it's important not to mix them up at the same time. You could say, for example, Apple, if you're voicing Apple. And you could gesture it in this way, and you could write it and show Apple. I think it's important to separate the 2 languages. You could show it and then sign glasses and then speak it, glasses, and then show the written words. So visual things. So in that way, you could develop both skills. That's important, but I wouldn't recommend doing it at the same time. It does need to be separated.
Yes, and I think most schools are, I believe, supporting that. Maybe not all schools for the deaf, but the speech and signing at the same time. I do believe that it is, it's coming back around, bilingualism. You were going to say?
I also want to emphasize that I don't expect the parents to be fluent in ASL right away. You can use gestures. You can be creative. I know, it's awkward at first and trying to learn, but you can use like glasses. You can gesture glasses. But as long as you're trying to communicate with your child, that's helping them to develop and to see that parents understand them and that you're understanding them. And that's very powerful. You don't have to follow a perfect ASL language. That can come later. But when they're young, be creative and use your gestures and see if you can communicate with your family members in those gestures as much as possible to make an environment accessible for the child to see what's going on, what's happening, especially at the dinner table. We call that dinner table syndrome. So there's research that calls it dinner table syndrome, where people in a hearing family often are the first people to finish their food, and then they leave when there's a deaf child there because they have no communication with their family members. And so they eat and then they leave. So this is an opportunity for parents who share their work experiences and the child at the night dinner table. It's such a rich environment for that relationship to develop and have. So be creative in your with games and with gestures and verbal things and everything that you can visualize to build a sense of a relationship, because it's very powerful.
Playing sports as well. All right, well, I don't see any other questions. So I guess that we will go ahead and wrap up. And before we close, I think, yes, you did type in your email. That's great. Go ahead and take note of his email. Feel free to contact him if you have any questions or if you'd like to chat with him later. And also, again, I want to thank you for your time,
Always.
for everybody being willing to be here. The information that you discussed tonight is so valuable to so many of us, probably all of us. in some way. So if you want to start your video again and say goodbye to him or show off your kids and have them wave goodbye, that's perfectly fine.
Hi. Have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Take care.
Have a wonderful night.
Happy holidays. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Happy New Year. 2021. Be healthy, everyone.
Yes, yes. Bye-bye.
Oh, that was all good. Thank you for your time. I so appreciate it. I'm sure they'll contact you if anything comes up.
Awesome.
You guys, you're the best. Thank you.
Bye-bye.